And for the gospel reading this morning, I've chosen a passage from Matthew. Jesus speaking to the crowds. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon, in all his splendor, was dressed like one of these. If this is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today, and tomorrow is thrown in the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given you as well. These are words inspired by God. So for the month of September, I chose as my theme, how did creation happen? And on September the 1st, I looked at the biblical theory of creation. And then on September the 8th, I looked at the scientific theory of creation. And then on the 15th, I gave my own theory of creation. So today I'm going to do a recap of those three homilies and then open it up to a Q&A. So first section, the biblical theory of creation. And I did this by exegeting chapter 1 of Genesis, taking particular verses and making commentary upon them and kind of differentiating between what the literal meaning suggests and what the deeper meaning actually is. So in the very first line of the first chapter of the first book of the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, the problem with this is it's an English translation, and it is a mistranslation. Because in the original Hebrew, it says Bereshit. It did not say Bareshit. There's a big difference in Hebrew. Bareshit means in the beginning. Reshit means in a beginning. So the first word of the Bible is not Bareshit, in the beginning. It is actually Reshit, in a beginning. So what Genesis chapter 1 is describing is not the ultimate origin of the cosmos or the planet itself. It's talking about a particular beginning. So it's not talking actually about the creation of the world, but I believe it's talking about the restoration of the world after some kind of a global disaster. Whether it was a comet strike or global fires or whatever it was, that the planet itself was shrouded in darkness for a long period of time. So there was no sun. And then you're going to get an ice age very, very quickly. And then when the ice melts, you're going to get a flood. And now you're going to have an extinction event. And we certainly have lots of mythology dealing with this. We've got the story of Lemuria and the story of Atlantis. And we know scientifically that in the Younger Dryas period, which happened 12,500 years ago, cometary fragments rained down on the ice cap of North America and released literally billions of tons of water into the oceans, creating a global flood. So the entire ice sheet of North America was set on fire and melted immediately, and the sea levels began to rise. So is that what it's talking about? Is it a kind of a reconfiguration of planet Earth after this? In verse 2 we read, it says, now the earth was formless and empty. So what does it mean to be formless and empty? If the entire sky is darkened for hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years, filled with smoke and debris of various kinds from some kind of a cometary smash, it means that whatever humans survived, they couldn't see forms, they couldn't see the forms of mountains or of trees. So the world appeared formless and empty because the human eye could not register form in the middle of that kind of darkness. And we read that, it says, and the Spirit of God, Ruach Yahweh, was hovering over the waters. Now, I think that this actually was some kind of a cleansing technological event, or an aircraft from God, or from ET sky beings that began some kind of a cleanup operation on planet Earth after this strike. It was a kind of what they call sometimes terraforming. If we ever get to Mars, we're going to have to try to create the conditions in which human beings can exist, and that's called terraforming. Now, is this actually an account of some kind of terraforming, that some kind of sky beings, advanced beings, or extraterrestrials were cleaning up the planet after this event? Verse 3 we read, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." So now you've got the breakthrough. The cloud cover is dissolving. The smoke string is dissolving. And now there's a breakthrough. The sun breaks through. And what happens? Photosynthesis can begin again. And now plants can grow. And now herbivores can live on the plants. And now carnivores can live on the herbivores. And so the whole system reconfigures itself. In verse 5 we read, "And there was evening and there was morning the first day." So what does that mean, the first day? It's the first day when the sun is visible again after perhaps thousands of years of radical darkness. But it's interesting, they say there was evening and there was morning the first day. You would imagine they would have said there was morning and there was evening, but that's not how it happened. It seems to me that when the sun finally made its appearance, it was literally evening time, and they're watching the globe go down, the sun globe go down, and then come up the next morning. And so that's why the Hebrews, when they count the day begins at sunset. And it's the very same thing for the Celts. For the Celts, the day begins at sunset. And so there's evening followed by morning, not morning followed by evening. In verse 9 we read, "And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry ground appear." So now the sun is out once more, the darkness is dissolving, and now the drying process can begin. And this happens again and again in human history. There are ice ages followed by desertification. We know, for instance, from the geological evidence, that less than 5,000 years ago, the present Sahara Desert was a huge freshwater lake. And so again and again, you get this process, this drying process, and so oceans receding and coming back again with ice ages. Verse 11 we read, "Then God said, let the land produce vegetation." So now flora can flourish, because for the first time in perhaps thousands of years, there's actually photosynthesis. And so now vegetation is possible. In verses 20 and 21 we read, "And God said, let the water teem with living creatures." So now marine life can flourish again, because the lack of sunlight kills even the algae. When you look at marine life, it all begins with elementary algae on which little fish live, and then the bigger fish live on the smaller fish. And so the process of marine life can only happen once the sun has made its appearance again. And then he says, "And let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So now again, perhaps after thousands of years, avian life can begin to flourish again. Now birds can fly. They're not trying to battle their way through soot, for thousands of years. In verses 26 and 27, we read that, "And God said, let us make mankind in our image and likeness." Now it's interesting, it's a plural. In the Hebrew, the word that's used is Elohim. And Elohim actually means the powerful ones. It is not a transcendent singular divinity. It's talking about some kind of a council of sky beings, or some kind of a council of extraterrestrials who are saying, okay, now let's revisit planet Earth and create some kind of a species that's in our image and our likeness. And so they mix their blood, which means their DNA, with some kind of earth beings, maybe pre-existing hominids. And so in the Semitic languages and in Swahili, there's like a triple pun. The word in Swahili for a human being is binadamu. Now, bin means son of. It's the very same in Hebrew and in the Semitic languages. Now, Adama means actually earth or soil. So Adam comes from Adama. The first human being comes from the earth or from the soil. But built into Adama is the word damu. And in Swahili and in the Semitic languages, damu means blood. So now you've got a mixture of the blood of these sky beings mixed with the earth itself, and then they breathe some kind of life into this. Now, what's the backstory to this extraordinary Genesis chapter 1? The backstory goes to 1849, when an archaeological dig unearthed the vast library of King Ashurbanipal, who was the king of Assyria around the year 660 BCE, before the Common Era. And it was discovered in an archaeological dig in 1849, and they unearthed 30,000 clay tablets, which are now in the British Museum. And one of those clay tablets is called the Enuma Elish, and it is the 7 tablets of creation. This is the oldest recorded story in the world. It is more than 5,000 years old, and it's a story about, you know, the origin of the universe that we've just described in Genesis. So the Genesis account borrows from this. It's much, much older than Genesis. There's another story in that cache called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it is the oldest flood story in the world. And it's an account of the sky beings, Anu, who was the chief god, who had 2 sons, Enlil and Enki. And at some stage, they're so fed up with the experiment Homo sapiens sapiens, they decide to wipe it out in a flood. But Enki tips off a man called Zeus-Sudra, to build an ark to kind of save, you know, humanity. Now, in the Bible, he would be called Noah. So it's the same story borrowed from the Sumerians. So the conclusion then to that first part is this: are these true stories? I believe that, I've said this to you many times, that mythology and stories are the archived wisdom of a culture. That's how a culture archives its wisdom, through story and through mythology. And so stories are the very best way to pass on wisdom to future generations, because they're entertaining, they're enduring, and they're dependent upon the state and stage of spiritual enlightenment of the listener to unpack it. And this is why Jesus insists on speaking only in parables. He will only use stories. He won't speak in theology or philosophy or scientific language. He'll speak in stories, because they're entertaining and they're enduring, and every member of the audience will unpack it according to their own ability. And so I would say that Irish mythology, African folklore, the Pitakas of Buddhism, the Upanishads of Hinduism, they all carry God's word, if you know how to listen. But you have to listen with your heart and your soul, not just your intellect. And so the Genesis account that I've just read for you is actually packed with precious germs, if you know how to wrestle with God, which is the actual meaning of the name Israel. The name Israel means the man who wrestled with God. So when you know how to wrestle with God, you know how to wrestle with the scriptures, then you can really understand what the basic message is. So that's what I had to say, you know, on the 1st of September about the biblical account of creation. On the 8th of September, I looked at the scientific theories of creation. Now, the basic system of science is that all sciences they operate by observation of the natural world and by experimentation. So it's observation and experimentation. They're the 2 great tools of the scientific method. And there's an actual protocol. It doesn't matter what branch of science you're studying, whether it's physics or geology, you know, we always go through the same stages. The first thing is that the scientist begins, you know, to make observations in her field of interest. Then secondly, she begins to gather some data points. Thirdly, she's looking for some putative patterns in the data. Are there some patterns discernible in the data, or is it totally random? Stage 4 is, if she detects some kind of a possible pattern, she's going to create a hypothesis to explain the pattern. Stage 4. Stage 5 is, she's going to have to set up now some kind of an experiment to test her hypothesis. If it turns out that her hypothesis is correct, she has to replicate it in somebody else's laboratory, because it could just be a statistical aberration. And so it has to be replicated by other scientists. If it now proves to be true, then you've established a law or a principle in the field. Then you put together a bunch of these principles and you've actually created a model of the field. Now, at some stage, new anomalous data are going to present themselves. And now you have to tweak the old model to accommodate the new anomalous data. But at some stage, no matter how much tweaking you do, the model is incapable of taking aboard the new anomalous data. So you have to abandon the old model and create a brand new model, which should be able to contain all the data from the old model and all the new anomalous data. So that's how the scientific works in general. Now, the scientific method has conferred extraordinary benefits in everything from transportation to communications to medicine to agriculture. But the scientific method has a shadow side and it's got real glaring inadequacies. So I'm going to point out what some of the problems are. The first and most obvious one is that what the scientists call dark matter and dark energy account for 95% of all the stuff in the universe. And they have no idea what dark matter is or dark energy is. They have a theory that dark energy somehow is causing the energy to expand at an accelerated rate. So this dark energy is pushing the universe, into bigger and bigger articulations of itself. And dark matter, according to them, is some kind of a supergravity which is causing the formation and the evolution of galaxies. So galaxies are holding together. So what's holding a galaxy together? Obviously, some kind of dark matter whose gravity is keeping the system together. So you've got these two opposite forces. Dark energy accelerating, the inflation of the universe, and dark matter that's holding galaxies together. So the problems are 95% of this is unknown. That's the first big problem with science. The second big problem with science, in my opinion, is its refusal to admit data from any state of consciousness except this so-called waking state. So they deny the input of altered states of consciousness. The data that come to you in your dreams, or in your visions, or in your transpersonal experiences, or in your meditation, these are real, important data, but they're not factored into the scientific model. The next problem is that the experimental method itself is based on probability theory. And so you cannot infer causation. You can infer it, but you can't actually prove it. All you can say is the probability that this particular thesis is correct. So you're talking about just probabilities and not proof. So given all those constraints, what are some of the origin myths of science? So one kind of version is that there have been 6 different theories of scientific theories throughout life. The first one is that science started off with a notion of a flat Earth, that the Earth itself was a plane suspended on legs with a dome on top of it. That was the first kind of theory of science. Then the second one was what would be called the geocentric model, that the Earth is actually the center of the entire cosmos and everything revolves about that. That was the second great scientific model. The third one was what would be called the heliocentric. Now we understand that the sun is not circumambulating the Earth, rather the Earth is circumambulating the sun. And so that we live at least in a solar system which is heliocentric, and all the known planets in our solar system are revolving around the sun. That was the next model. The next model would be called the galacticocentric. The notion that somehow, the sun, obviously, our solar system is not the center because we're spiraling around a galaxy called the Milky Way galaxy. So it must be that the entire universe is circumambulating our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy. And then that was abandoned. And then they come up with the notion of the Big Bang, that it all started with an instantaneous bang. And then the final one was called the inflationary Big Bang theory, that it continues to expand, out into space. Now, another version of these creation myths is that there were 7 kinds of phases to cosmic evolution. So what were they? The first kind of phase is that the only thing that existed was particulate matter, like dust particles, that the entire universe was filled with just dust particles. And then stage 2 is that somehow these dust particles began to coagulate into galaxies. And so after the galaxies come the stars. You think that stars come before galaxies. It's not the case. The galaxies come first. So the galaxy is just particular masses of dust that are kind of clustering together because of the gravitational attraction. So the galaxies come first. And then as the gravity continues, this material now constellates into particular suns, stellar systems and planetary systems. So that will be the next stage of process. And then on, say, planets like the Earth, you now have some kind of chemistry taking over. So chemical reactions either in the suns or the planets themselves. And then the next stage, number 6, is the biological stage, that chemistry has resulted in life, the creation of life. So now biology takes place. And the final stage they would believe is, they would call it the cultural stage, that now human beings are creating the next kind of stage of life on planet Earth. Now, according to this latest theory then, the Big Bang created space, time, energy, and matter. These are the four great constants of science: space, time, energy, and matter. And Einstein's formula of relativity ties all of these together: E equal to mc squared. So when you then ask the question, what happened before the Big Bang, and where did the Big Bang happen? And the scientists will kind of shrug this off and say, that's nonsensical. That doesn't make any sense, because the Big Bang created time and created space. So there was no before and there was no where. Now, this is a kind of pathetic kind of a realization. The basic questions of the scientific method in all other areas are about answering four questions. You take any branch of science, and the basic questions you have to answer in any branch of science are who? Because there's always some intelligent agent behind everything we experience in the natural world. There's always a who, some intelligent agent, not necessarily a human agent, but some intelligence. That's the who behind. The next question is what? There has to be a discrete event that kind of caused what you're now observing in the world around you. The third one is when. At what definite time did that event take place that created the consequence? And fourthly, where did it happen? So you're dealing with any other branch of science, you're going to have to answer those four questions. Who is responsible? What intelligent agent is responsible? What was the discrete event that happened? When? At what time did it occur? And where? In what particular location did it occur? Now, in the case of the Big Bang theory, there is no who, there is no when, and there is no where. And the what is the simplistic notion of an explosion that started smaller than a single atom and now encompasses the entire cosmos. And that's how ridiculous this notion of the Big Bang is. I've been talking about this for many, many years. The problem with the basic problem with the scientific method is the problem of the postulates. The basic problem of postulates is this: like any religion or any philosophy, science is based on unproven and unprovable postulates. Yes, all of science is based on faith. So one of the articles of faith is sometimes called Uniformitarianism, the belief somehow that all the laws of the universe are the same everywhere throughout all of time. Now, there's actually evidence showing that that gravity is different and that the speed of light changes. And now with the Webb telescope, we're beginning to find galaxies way, way, way far out from us that are calling into question the Big Bang itself. It's not consistent with the Big Bang theory. Now, the most basic law of the scientific method is the law of karma. Karma simply means cause and consequence. You see a consequence, you're always looking for a cause. You see a cause, and you're looking for a consequence of that cause. So the scientific belief in the Big Bang calls for a causeless consequence, a mega miracle that makes faith in the resurrection of Jesus and the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception look like minor miracles. So let me begin with mathematics. Pure mathematics is often called the queen of the sciences. It is abstract reasoning at its most elegant and its most unencumbered. And yet, it is based on faith. In 1889, an Italian mathematician called Giuseppe Peano created the 5 axioms of natural numbers. They're known as the Peano postulates, P-E-A-N-O postulates, and are meant to be a rigorous basis for the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., which are used in arithmetic and number theory and set theory. Now, the problem is none of these postulates can be proven. But if you take them on faith, they can build very powerful and actually very useful theories. But by the beginning of the 20th century, scientists in general and mathematicians in particular were becoming convinced that they were on the verge of creating a system that could be built from the ground up without any need for faith or postulates. Alas, for human hubris, along came a brilliant young Austrian mathematician called Kurt Gödel, who in 1931 proved that no axiomatic system of natural numbers can be both complete and consistent. It can be one or the other, but it cannot be both. And it's not just that mathematicians aren't yet clever enough to manage it. Gödel proves that it can't be done, ever, by anybody. So faith in at least one unproven postulate will always be necessary. Now, long before Gödel and before Peano, Euclid ran into the same problem. So some 2,200 years ago, as Euclid is putting his geometry together, he created what he called the elements, his set of geometry propositions. And these are based on 5 unproven and unprovable postulates. The frustrating thing is that these postulates appear to be self-evident. Like, for instance, one of the postulates says that the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. That seems to be self-evident. Obvious? Yes. Provable? No. Not even by the finest mathematical minds over the last 23 centuries have been able to prove, in actual fact, to prove it, that the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. So once again, faith is necessary. So that's what I had to say about the scientific theories of creation. Then on the 15th of September, I dealt with some of my own theories of creation. I started off by saying that there are many ways, voluntary and involuntary, of entering an altered state of consciousness. So a voluntary way of entering an altered state of consciousness would be meditation, or spending time with little children in their games, or dance, or music, or poetry, or art, or ritual, or plant medicine, stuff like that. These are kind of voluntary ways of creating an altered state of consciousness. And then there are involuntary ways, pain, fever, witnessing a tragedy that creates immediately an altered state of consciousness. Now, both mythology and science then build their theories of reality on the experiences, which are called visions and dreams in spirituality and called research in science. So they're built upon these foundations. And the most basic question mythology, spirituality, and science have ever asked is the question, where did all this come from? That's the most basic question that mythology is attempting to answer, that spirituality is attempting to answer, and that science is attempting to answer. Now, my own theory, and this came to me in a fever when I was really, really sick 2 years ago. This notion that only God existed. There was no time, there was no space, there was no energy, and there was no matter. And therefore, no experiences were possible. God could not have experiences if only God existed. And there is no time, space, energy, or matter, then God can't have experiences. And so God self-fractures into millions of holographic fractals that the Hebrew will call netzotzim. Now, a hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its separate parts. And a fractal is an image that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So now God, firstly, God created the netzotzim. So self-fractured into netzotzim, emanated from self. Now, I believe that there was an extraordinary conference called together between God and the netzotzim, and they decided to have fun, to do something fun. So they decided to create a cosmos with galaxies and stars and planets and moons. So initially then, these cosmic co-creators, God and souls, are witnesses to what they have co-created. And Buddhism will call this turiya, or the witnessing consciousness, the ability to observe without ever participating in. But there was a second synod, a second conference call, in which they decided to become part of the cosmos. And so the eternal souls set up finite avatars in order to experience the cosmos from the inside. And they really got into it, planning a whole range of dimensions, from the 10th dimensional entities, which are pure love, or light, or laughter, all the way down to us three-dimensional, and three-dimensional planets and beings on it. Now, the souls were asked then to volunteer to incarnate in various levels and densities of this co-created cosmos. And a very precious few, hardy, adventurous, and truly loving souls volunteered for the third dimensional world, this world. Now, the higher the dimension, the less is the separation from source. So 10D beings have almost no separation from source. The lower dimensionals have a much greater sense of separation, like us human beings. So then incarnation becomes a game. Hinduism will call this the game of Lila. And the game is to promote personal, planetary, and even cosmic evolution. It's a game in which you agreed to experience the constraints and the rules of three-dimensional living. And Christ took the ultimate dive, where he descended into hell after his death on the cross in order to experience the ultimate sense of separation from source. Now, I believe then in my vision, God wanted to make sure that the volunteers could agree to a whole new set of restrictions and limitations on free will. And so, for instance, they had to kind of shrink from being cosmic beings to being caught in these little spacesuits. They had to shrink from cosmic intelligence to operate with this little laptop that we carry between our ears. They had to create the illusion of time because the brain is so small that it cannot grok the entire gestalt. So we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces and process them sequentially, thus giving rise to the illusion of time. And then fourthly, we agree to amnesia for who we are, why we've come, and where our home is, so that we can discover it on our own. Now, in the heel of the hunt, then, it means that you are a three-dimensional volunteer. And all of the cosmic co-creators, I believe, are deeply, deeply grateful to those who volunteer for human incarnation. When Christ said famously, no greater love exists than to lay down one's life for one's friends, I don't think he was just talking about, sacrificing his physical human body on the cross. He was talking about the fact that although he was God, he did not cling to his divinity with God, but accepted being a human being. And Paul says in his letter to the Philippians, have that same mindset in you that was also in Christ Jesus, because you too exhibited that same love of that extraordinary love that you laid down your life for your friends by taking on physicality and being born into the human condition. So, but never forget that as a holographic fractal of source, you have never left the heart of God. The vast bulk of your energy is always resident with God. It's only the part that incarnated in the spacesuit that has forgotten who you are. So these souls then made what I've called preconception contracts. And they came onto planet Earth in order to awaken the self, the culture, the planet, and the cosmos. Knowing, as we were coming in, knowing just four things. We knew the track history of all the players and of myself, that I was going to spend the next incarnation with. We knew the mission we were on, and we chose the era and the area and the culture and the family into which we were going to parachute. And then it's improv theater. There's no plot and there's no script. And so what does the ascension-descension process look like? So the first part is the descent from God to human beings. So initially there is just source, utter transcendence. And then God self-fractures into souls, and this is the beginning of immanence. This is how God reveals herself through creation. But the souls stay connected via the causal body or the psychic body. So this is a kind of a level of entanglement theory at a soul level. Then coming down further, each soul adopts a mental body, the place of the archetypes, what Plato would call the ideal realm. Then we come down even further to the astral body, the body we inhabit in our dreams, in our emotions, and in parallel lifetimes. And then the next level down is the etheric body, the elan vital, the energy of the system. And then finally, the physical body, which is ground zero. And the problem is, most of us tend to identify with ground zero. But Gaia herself has done the same thing. So there was a descent not just from God to human beings, there was a descent from God to Gaia. And so Gaia is working her way back up through that system. So we experience Gaia firstly as a physiosphere, just a third rock from the sun in a particular solar system. But the next level up is, it is the atmosphere. It is the womb that the earth created around itself in order to be able to generate life. It's the place where we study chemistry. And then life emerges, and this is the biosphere, which is studied by biology. Now we're in the fourth stage, what Tyler de Chardin called the noosphere, the sheath of consciousness that surrounds the biosphere. And we're seeing it, for instance, with the internet, stuff like that. And it's a very dangerous stage. As you move from biosphere to noosphere, you develop all kinds of technology that are capable of radically disrupting life on planet Earth and even blowing up the planet itself. But there's a place beyond the noosphere. I call it the animasphere. The anima as in spirit, as in soul. And then there's the pneumosphere, the kind of place of mysticism. And finally, what I would call the cosmosphere, the place of unitive consciousness. So you've heard the biblical account of creation. You've heard the scientific account of creation. You've heard my account of creation. Now go figure out your own theory of the origin of the universe.
I, as an artist, am interested in what you said about the changing speed of light and how I can't even figure that out. Any comments you have would be enlightening.
Yeah. And so there's a very interesting English biologist called Rupert Sheldrake, brilliant guy, who's written copiously on this area. And in conversations with top physicists in Oxford in England, where he trained, he showed that the speed of light is actually an agreed upon number that scientists get together and they try to create an agreement. But the measurements do not, correspond with it. So there's evidence that, the speed of light has changed and is changing. And so what they do is they create a number and then they force the data to kind of come up with the same number. But it's obvious from the data themselves that the speed of light is changing. And there's very definite evidence that gravity is different. And as I said, just very, very recently, the Webb Space Telescope that went up just very, very recently is beginning to discover galaxies way beyond, what was known, which is casting into doubt the entire theory of the Big Bang and the inflationary theory. So all the parameters are up for change. So that's why I mentioned this kind of what do you call it, heresy called Uniformitarianism. This belief system is an article of faith, there's no proof for it, that all the laws of science are exactly the same everywhere in the universe and throughout all of time, all of 13.8 billion years of the theory. So there'd be no changes in time and no changes in place. And the Webb telescopes being assured that that's not true. Now, before that, other scientists were beginning to call into question, that the speed of light isn't constant and gravity is not constant. And so we have to revise completely the basic tenets, because science has made a kind of a religion of itself. It's created, tenets of faith that you have to accept in order to be a member of the thinking community. But they're not proven. They're theories, and if you repeat a theory often enough, it becomes a truth. Growing up as a Catholic, you had to accept, the 10 Commandments of Moses and the 6 Commandments of the Church and all the laws of Roman Catholicism. And if you had to believe that these were laws which were given by God through Peter and they're unchanging forever. And then suddenly limbo disappears. And now suddenly, it's not a mortal sin anymore to eat meat on a Friday. And so all of these laws that were enshrined and embedded in our psyches, we begin to realize they're totally made up. And it's the same with scientific theories. They're theories. They're models that best explain our present level of sophisticated data kind of inference. And so we have to realize that science has become a kind of a religion. It's a scientism that insists on fundamentalist belief systems. And if you don't believe in these, you're out. You're a kind of a non-thinking human being. So light is one of those kind of aspects, which obviously is not constant everywhere throughout all of time.
I've listened to your three or four homilies back on YouTube, and it's been mind-blowing, and you've took me into another dimension, and I've actually stopped and meditated on some of the words that you've said, and I've got about 50 questions here, but I'll try and keep it to one, right? Okay. Now, you mentioned where we have been reincarnated. We volunteered to be reincarnated on Earth just now in a third dimension. Am I right? Saying
yes.
that right?
Yes.
Right.
You are. Right on.
Now, if and when I die and we all die, is it possible that in our reincarnation again, we'll go back into a fourth dimension when we've got more wisdom or more light or more connected to the source through our consciousness?
That's a great question, Billy. So my belief system is that any soul can kind of incarnate at any level of the dimension. But your ability has to be commensurate with the energy of the place the level at which you're incarnating. So you're not going to put a 7-year-old child into advanced calculus and expect them to kind of make sense of it. And so we titrate our own abilities and we gravitate towards kind of energies that are consistent with or kind of push us a little bit further. I remember listening to a great tennis player one time, and he said, I always try to play with people who are slightly better than me, because I'll develop my skill set. If I play with people who are much better than me, I lose heart. And if I play with people that I can easily defeat, I'm not learning anything. So I'm always going to try to play against people who are slightly better than me, so I continue to grow. So I think that that's the trajectory of the souls as we reincarnate from period of time to period of time. That we're trying to push the envelope in order to kind of improve the kind of the wisdom of the soul, but not overextending ourselves too much. So I think, for instance, that there are people who incarnate on planet Earth into the 3 dimension, and they take on a lifestyle, they're born into a family or a period of time for which they're not suited. They don't have the ability to survive in those circumstances. And sometimes those people will commit suicide because they realize I've bitten off more than I can chew. So we have mentors at the other side that try to tailor the next incarnation to our abilities and to our lesson plan. And so, but we're free to say, no, I'm going to do it my own way. And if we do it in such a way that we bite off more than we can chew, we're creating hell on earth for ourselves. And in some cases, we're going to say, okay, I'm out of here. I can't take this anymore. So the level at which we incarnate is determined by the level of advancement of the soul and the mentoring from the angelic beings who are in charge of our ascension process.
You talked about scientists saying 95% of what we think is there, we don't know any idea what it is.
Right.
I've read some Teresa of Avila, Rudolf Steiner. They speak in the same language, talking about spiritual eyes to see and spiritual ears to hear.
Right.
Perhaps that's what we need to see, the dark matter and dark energy, if that's what they are. I'm wondering, do you think there's a way to develop that? Or do you think there's a lot of buzz these days about we're moving from 3-dimensional to 5th-dimensional? Do you think it might be a dimensional seeing and hearing, such as no doubt Christ and Buddha and other avatars have had? What's your thought on that?
That's a great question. Great question, Fred. I totally agree with you that all of these mystical figures have understood higher understandings of the entire cosmos and the entire evolution of the cosmos and our place in it and our mission to continue to evolve. And so obviously, in order to understand stuff that we don't presently understand, we need an increase of intelligence, but not necessarily the ability to rationalize, but rather the ability to engage our psychic forces. So when I talked about, Hinduism's 7 level of bodies, there's the physical body, they call the gross body, which is vibrating between infrared and ultraviolet, between 400 and 700 nanometers. We can see it and taste it and touch it and smell it. Now, above that, there's the etheric body, the élan vital, which is operating at a higher frequency. And this is what will sometimes be seen, for instance, in Oriental medicine, energy systems, acupuncture, stuff like homeopathy, that is engaging the energy system of the body. The 3rd level above is the astral body. And at the astral body, time and space and matter disappear. When you're dreaming at night, there is no time and there is no space and there is no matter. Your dream life is creating your reality. And so I've used this example many times. I have a dream where I'm with my grandfather who died in 1956. I'm back in my childhood home, which is 6,000 miles to the east of where I now live, and I'm having an encounter with my grandfather. And so I've transcended time and space and matter. So at the astral level, the only thing that's left is energy. Space, time, and matter have disappeared. So now I'm interacting with reality at a far different level. Now, it's at this level that I dream, at this level that I have visions, and at this level that I intersect with parallel lifetimes. The 4th level is the mental body. It's called Plato's ideal realm, the place of the archetypes. The archetypes, of which the physical world are simply printouts. There's, for instance, a simple example. There is no such thing as a perfect circle. You can't draw a perfect circle. I don't compare whether you have a compass or a protractor or whatever you have. The texture of the paper, and the kind of thickness of the pencil is going to determine what happens, and it won't be perfect. But there is a perfect ideal one in the mental body. So there are perfect archetypes of everything we encounter in different form here. The 5th level is the psychic body, and that's where our gifts like clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, psychokinesis, telepathy, precognition, they all exist, and they're all part of us already. So when we get access to that, then we have a totally different understanding of the universe in which we find ourselves. And then number 6 is the soul self, the holographic fractal of God, and then ultimately there's God itself. So the question is, at what level can I operate? Which level do I have access to right now? And there are techniques for accessing those areas. And I've mentioned them before. Meditation, time spent with little children, walking in nature on your own, an art form, dancing, architecture, stuff like this, where you're in contact with, it's your intuitive faculty that's making contact with the message, which is why Jesus continually says, he'll say stuff like, when they ask him, why are you always speaking in parables? And the first answer he gave, he says, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand, hearing you may hear, but not comprehend. Because you're listening with your ears and you're trying to understand with your brain, and that ain't going to work. You've got to listen to me at a far different level. So that's why I differentiate between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is simply data that are generated by the sensorium, yeah, and processed by the brain. Wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And therefore, in order to understand what we now call dark matter and dark energy, we have to transcend the sensorium and the kind of the instrumentation, which is simply an amplification of our sensorium, and engage the higher faculties, the intuitive faculties, in order to say, now I see it. Now I see what the connections are. And then it won't be dark anymore. It'll be as luminous as the sun itself. So it's a question of developing the kinds of techniques like the saints whom you have mentioned in all the great traditions, because they're no longer identified with their physical self or their emotional self, not with their professions, not with their relationships, not with their physical bodies. They're identified with their soul selves, and therefore they have access to data and kind of information which is not available readily merely to the intellect.
For a while, I've been feeling like it's wrong to imagine that creation happened. That creation is, by nature of the God being the creator, creation must continue. Then we are moving onward, and that looks for a long time like decreation, like destruction, like evil. But then the resolution, we're you might say pushed into seeing the resolution through a higher awareness of the creative spirit of the universe, of God. So that's how I'm looking at positive, negative these days, to cope with the conflict between good and evil as a force of creation. As destruction happens, then the next stage is a higher state of evolution.
You're making two great points, Marty. So the first one is about the notion of creation per se. And the second one is kind of the reality of evil. What does evil really mean? So let me just deal with those two separately. The first one is, you're not alone here. Probably the greatest philosopher next to Plato in the ancient world was a guy called Plotinus. He lived about the year 200 AD. And he said very famously, speaking in Latin, he said he did not believe in creatio ex nihilo, but rather emanatio ab Deo. I do not believe, he said, in creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. I believe in emanatio ab Deo. I believe in emanation from God. So there's a big difference between God going into his workshop on a Monday morning saying, today I'm going to create elephants. And then on Tuesday saying, today I'm going to create mosquitoes. That it doesn't happen like that. That literally everything that exists is an emanation from source. And that's why I say, for instance, that souls, the Netzot, were not a creation by God. They were an emanation. They were a holographic fractal of self. So it was an emanation from source. A simple example I use sometimes is, if I take a daffodil bulb and I put it in the ground, and I cover it over, and a few months later, I see a big green stalk coming up, typically here around February or March. And then at some stage, there's a beautiful yellow flower that arrives. Now, the question I asked myself, did the bulb create the green stalk? And the answer is no. And did the stalk create the yellow flower? And the answer is no. That both the stalk and the flower were emanations from the essence of the bulb. The bulb had within itself the ability to manifest in stages, like the stalk stage and the flower stage. So it's emanation from source, not creation from nothing. So I agree totally with the first piece there. And that's what I saw in this particular vision of mine. It was God emanating, first emanating as souls, and then these getting together and emanating from self, a cosmos, and then inhabiting the cosmos in order to be participant observers in the cosmos. Which brings then to your second brilliant question. Whence then the notion of evil and what might be the purpose? Now, I believe that once you bring free will into the equation, then people are going to make choices for self rather than choices for other. And every single one of us is born at the totally kind of self-centered end of the spectrum. Every little infant is totally self-centered. It needs to be in order to survive infancy. So it needs milk, it needs mother's breast, it needs comforting, it needs kind of warmth, it needs all these things. So it's a narcissist. Every little infant is a narcissist. But throughout life, we're supposed to grow until we reach a place like a Mother Teresa, where we're in service to others. But once we have free will, there's always the possibility of constantly choosing service to self. And when you choose that, you create darkness. And when this darkness is created, it leads to kind of greed. and then it leads to selfishness, and then it leads to envy of others, and then it leads to robbery of others' resources, and then it leads to violence, and then it leads to war. So the decisions for self kind of service will bear within it the fruit of creating division. Now, the second part of your second question then is very important. Now, what do we do with these data then? When these situations arise and you find people acting really, really selfishly, what can be gained from that? How can you harvest that? That's not to justify evil and say that evil in some senses is good, but that even evil is an opportunity to harvest a greater form of good. And so now you go back to what you've taken for granted and you realize, I can't take it for granted. This has to be worked for. This has to be cherished, and this has to be evolved. And so now in a very strange way, the evil, the selfishness, which was not intended to benefit anybody except the self, now becomes the opportunity for the entire system to make a giant leap in understanding what the purpose of incarnation in itself was. And so you're absolutely right. Then the darkness becomes an opportunity for reclaiming the light. And I think that's part of the story of Genesis, where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created light. What happened? He peeled back the darkness of narcissism in order that the sun of the soul could begin to shine on the human condition again. But in the absence of the darkness, which went on for maybe thousands of years, humanity had no appreciation of light and of plants and of food, had no appreciation because it couldn't witness it. It had it before the flood or before the event, but it didn't appreciate it, it took it for granted. And so darkness, in some senses, is just to wake us from our stupor of accepting the miracles with which we are surrounded as our birthright, rather than realizing they're an extraordinary gift that need to be appreciated and built upon. And in that sense, yes, absolutely. We have to use the current circumstances as individuals, into community, on a global level, in order to grow even further and reveal further the face of God.
I appreciate your words about that there's so much we don't know and we don't understand. And, when I was younger, I used to really have a fear of uncertainty. And so, uncertainty, that which is unknown, was scary. And so I would try to control things or whatever. And as I've evolved on my spiritual journey, I've realized that there's just a unified field, right? There's just unification, and we're one in all that is. And there's so much that we don't know, and that's okay, because our path, or my path, is to just breathe into my heart, which is the access point, and to tune in to the unified field, right? Being one with all that is. And to just breathe into that and just take our next best step every day, and to transcend fears as much as we can, because when we transcend our fears and transcend control and the need for grasping and all of that, we can just really tap into, God and the unified field and the flow state, and miracles happen all the time because we are surrendering and trusting.
Thanks, Andrea. Great. So let me just give you a simple mathematical or kind of geometrical metaphor for what you're saying. The realization that the more we know, the more we don't know. And so we're always going to live with some level of anxiety if we focus on what we don't know, in the sense of that it's fear-inspiring rather than it's an invitation to continue to grow. If you take a bubble in a bath, literally a bubble trapped in water, and as it begins to expand, it begins to rise towards the top. Now, there's a very elegant mathematical formula that tells you what the surface area of a sphere is. Now, as the bubble is rising up through the water, it's expanding, which means its surface area is getting bigger and bigger. But that also means that there's more of the bubble in contact with the water than there was before. Now, if the water represents that which we don't know, and the bubble represents that which we do know, the fact that the bubble gets larger and larger, and there means that the contact area between what we know and what we don't know continues to increase. So there is no limitation to this, because we live not just in an infinite physical cosmos, we live in an infinite metaphysical context. And so the notion that heaven is a place we get to where we have all the answers and we can stop growing, and we're assigned a seat and a harp and a song sheet, and we're singing to God for the rest of eternity, that's really, really boring. But that's what it's about. We are literally a bubble of wisdom moving through a kind of a bath filled with the mystery of source, so that the more we expand, the more conflict area exists between what we know and what we don't know. And the journey of life is to welcome that as an ongoing journey. And so that we can respond to that by being anxious for the fact that, you know, things seem to be getting more and more complex, rather than things seem to be getting more and more beautiful, because we are acquiring more wisdom, but there's always more wisdom than can be acquired.
What I'd like to just focus in on for a minute, it ties into your work with Setting God Free, and with Paul Wallace's work and Mauro Beligno's work, and about mistranslation in the Old Testament that has led to misunderstandings in how we interpret the New Testament, and how a lot of it's been carried on in historically in the church, where we still have some of the Elohim and Yahwist, you know, narratives, you know, promulgated into today. And basically what the question is can you kind of clarify Jesus's relationship to the Elohim and Yahweh, and what the church has done with mistranslation in the New Testament, with that whole issue of the Yahweh stories?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so you're absolutely right. You know, in some sense, maybe what the most important question Christ was ever asked was this, you know, of the 613 precepts of Torah, which is the most important? And his answer was simple. The single most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole mind. And then he said, and as a bonus, I'll throw in the second most important. You didn't ask me, but I'll throw it in anyway. It is to love your neighbor as yourself. So Christ is reducing the entirety of legislation down to love. So he's talking about the essence of God is love, and the only commandment is to realign with love. And you find this in one of John's letters, where John says very famously, people are asking him questions constantly. Tell us about Jesus. You know, you walked with him. Tell us something else he did or say. What did he look like? Tell us something like this. And he would keep going back and say, little children, love one another. They say, yeah, we know that. But tell us about Jesus. You know, what kind of an accent did he have? And John would say, little children, love one another. And they got really upset with him. So finally he said, there's only one commandment. Love, and then do what you will. If you're based in love, you don't need commandments. You don't need legislation, because you're only always going to act out of this place. And so the essence of God is love. I had, you know, I seed my dreams regularly. Just about 4 nights ago, before I went to sleep, I asked myself the question, can you give me a pithy, a kind of definition of Christ consciousness? I woke up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and the answer was this. Christ consciousness is the kind of the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all creatures. It's very simple, that's it. Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all creatures. And that was Christ's message. So you don't need laws or legislation when you get that. When you're in that mindset and you recognize the divinity in everything else, and that's a permanent state for you, then you've arrived at Christ consciousness, or what Hinduism would call the self-enlightenment, you know, or the Buddha nature. You know, so it's just coming to that place where you realize, where you can say namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And I'm not just saying that to Kevin Skillen. I'm saying it to the bunny rabbit outside. I'm saying it to the oak tree on the hilltop. I'm saying it to the clouds and to the sun itself. So that's basically what Jesus was talking about. You know, come into Christ consciousness and realize that then you're going to see the inner divinity of all that is, which is why he picked today's passage. Look at the lilies of the field. If you look at the lilies, you're looking at God. If you know how to look, if you've got Christ consciousness, you will see God in the lilies. Look at the birds of the heavens. If you see, you know, God in the birds of the heavens, you've arrived at Christ consciousness. Then there's no need for law. There's no need for legislation. There's no need for dogma. There's no need for theology. There's only listen to your soul self.